All right. So today we're talking about growing sectionalism. This term sectionalism is kind of a big deal. I think typically today we think of it as more of a playful thing, but back then it was definitely like a tense, kind of not so fun thing. I always kind of give the example of like if you start driving north or you start driving west at a certain time or a certain point in time, you're going to stop seeing Bojangles. And that's kind of like a southern North Carolina kind of rooted thing. But in other parts of the U.S., it's not as big of a deal, or it's not even present. So what we're going to talk about here is sectionalism back in the 1800s. Okay, couple big things here is the Missouri Compromise. Also talk about some other things related to Andrew Jackson's presidency. If you haven't kind of picked up on this already, Andrew Jackson is a big deal in this part of American history. Um, it's kind of like Washington and the first five presidents kind of all set a tone for the presidency. We get John Quincy Adams, who's kind of maybe a little less hands on, and then Jackson makes a big splash. So I'll just keep going here. Big deal here is the Missouri Compromise is it's kind of just turning up the temperature on the topic of slavery. We've of course already talked about slavery in the context of the Constitutional Convention with the Three-Fifths Compromise. There's also the slave trade compromises that ends importation of slaves into the U.S. Um, but this compromise as well, another compromise in this early part of American history, is going to highlight the fact that there are definitely slave states and definitely non-slave states or free states. And so this Missouri Compromise really highlights that. When Missouri gets enough people to apply for statehood in 1819, there is a pretty tense question of whether Missouri is going to be a free state or a slave state. At the present moment, the United States, or in 1819, the U.S. is balanced 11 free states and 11 slave states. So if you add Missouri as a slave state, which is what they wanted to be, then you've upset that balance. And of course, I mentioned it's not just the balance of like numbers and like states on a map. You're actually talking about representation in government. Having 12 slave states means there's pretty much two senators who are probably going to be pro slavery. And that kind of tilts the balance towards slaveocracy, or this kind of term that historians use for a government that is controlled by slave owners. So the compromise here is we're going to add Missouri in yellow here, and we're also going to add Maine, which is ME up here. Maine is, at this point in time, territory that is part of Massachusetts. As bizarre as that sounds, Massachusetts is this one here with the little hook on the end. So Massachusetts actually has that land, but to keep the balance, we're going to slice off a portion of Massachusetts and turn it into a new state. You'll actually see this again, this kind of concept, because there's a state right here where my cursor is. Let me do my mouse pointer here. Give me fireworks. Oh, no. Well, that kind of worked. All right, focus. All right, there we go. So right where my focus is a future state called West Virginia. So during the Civil War, West Virginia is going to break off of Virginia. West Virginia, which is very mountainy, did not have many slaves, and so they joined the Union. And of course, Virginia is part of the Confederacy. So, okay, stop focusing. There we go. All right, so this guy here is named James Talmage. He's going to also propose some things that are going to upset the South. So he's going to say slaveholders cannot bring new slaves into Missouri. All enslaved children currently in Missouri would be freed at the age of 25. And the House accepted this stuff, mostly made of Northerners, because again, the House is based off population. So there's higher populations in the North. But the Senate rejects it because the Senate is balanced 50-50, 50% northern states, 50% slaveholding states. So they're not going to, the southern states are not going to forget this. They're going to be like, this guy's got it out for us. He's trying to end slavery. He's trying to take our property, blah, blah, blah. They're really upset. But he thinks this is kind of a fair compromise. Missouri is a slave state, but like doesn't have a ton of slaves there yet. So he's trying to kind of lessen the impact of slavery. He doesn't want slavery to spread across the entire U.S. He kind of wants to like keep it where it is. And what he is going to kind of represent is something that a young politician named Abraham Lincoln is going to represent, and that is the Free Soilers. So they're not a party yet, but they become a party called the Free Soil Party. Um, they are not advocating to end slavery. They are advocating to stop the expansion of it. So free soil would be any new soil or any new states added to the U.S. would be free states. So Missouri Compromise, as I mentioned, we have Missouri. You can see here on this map, it's green with the other slave states, and Maine, which on this map is red for the free states. Again, you've got some territory out here that is not fully organized yet. Not enough people there to apply for statehood. So we'll get to those states. Yeah, the other parts here is Henry Clay is hugely influential in this. We've talked about Henry Clay before, but he is kind of a big deal in compromising. He's going to be hugely influential in this compromise, and then he's going to pop up again in 30 years' time. And it's kind of wild that he is still around in 30 years because he's pretty old here, and he's going to be even older in 1850 when he proposes another compromise called the Compromise of 1850. And there he is. This portrait, I want to say, would have been somewhere around this time period, maybe 1830. He is going to have a photograph later on in life, and you will see how old he gets. Um, and I always like to make the joke that Henry Clay was so famous for compromising that when the Grim Reaper showed up, he even made a compromise with him to live longer. So there's old Henry Clay, who, yeah, doesn't look quite as healthy in his photograph from circa 1850s. Okay, lots of text here, but essentially they're getting upset that there's more discussion around slaves popping up, and also this problem here, the Missouri State Constitution Convention added a clause that would not allow free African Americans to enter the state. So what this essentially means is if you're black and you go into Missouri, then you could be forced into slavery. And that kind of really challenges this whole conception of where slavery should or should not exist, which we're definitely going to get to. I've already kind of hinted at this, but the Republican Party at this time is going to start to splinter a little bit here. So there is Splinter, which is a reference to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And they're going to be kind of broken up into different pieces. So we're going to have the anti-Masonic Party, which is people that did not like Freemasons. We're going to have the Free Soilers, as I mentioned, and then eventually we're going to have the brand new Republican Party, which will kind of die off in a little bit and then pop up again in about 1850s. 1854, I want to say, is when they run their first candidate. Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican president elected. So, yeah. 1824's election is a little chaotic. We were kind of used to, at this point in history, having like two people run and one person wins, and it's pretty simple. Of course, going back even earlier, the first few elections we had first place would become president, second place would become the vice president. We've done away with that now. But what we have here is Henry Clay, as I've already mentioned. He's pretty famous from this compromise, Missouri Compromise. He is based out of the West, specifically Kentucky is his home state. We've got Andrew Jackson, who's based out of the West, air quotes, because that's Tennessee. Jackson was born in North Carolina, but moved out to Tennessee, so he gets a name for himself there. And we've mentioned Andrew Jackson before because he was a famous general at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, which is technically after the end of the War of 1812. We have John Quincy Adams, who is probably the most famous name on here, mostly though because of his dad, John Adams. He is from Massachusetts. He is also James Monroe's Secretary of State. James Monroe is the president at the time, and the Secretary of State had been typically a stepping stone to the White House. So we see Washington's Secretary of State Jefferson become president. We see Jefferson's Secretary of State Monroe become president. This cycle is fairly common in the early part of American history. Not so common today. The last Secretary of State we had run for president was in 2016, and that was Hillary Clinton, who was one of Barack Obama's secretaries of state. She did not win. And so, again, the tone of maybe that kind of early American history pattern is maybe a little less present in today's politics. And then we also have another guy here who's pretty famous in colonial and early American history in the South, and that's William Crawford. He is from the state of Georgia, and he's really focused on a states' rights thing. Okay. Now, when you see states' rights in this part of American history, you're really talking about states' rights to protect the institution of slavery. They do not want a federal government banning slavery, so they're arguing for states' rights. Um, it's kind of a code word. States' rights is really code word for we love slavery. Okay. You're going to see similar things happen when we get into the 20th century. A lot of Southern politicians will argue for something, for states' rights. But what they're actually saying is we want the states' rights to keep segregation, right? To kind of prop up racism. So it's not that every person ever in American history has argued for states' rights and is not racist. It just so happens that many of the arguments for states' rights in American history are about race. So we'll see how this election plays out. 4 candidates, all with their little kind of bases of support. Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams are the two most famous guys here. Andrew Jackson, of course, from the battle I've already mentioned. John Quincy Adams from his presidency, or from his dad's presidency, I should say. And so the crazy thing that happens here is Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote. But you guys all pass civics, and you know that you don't have to win the popular vote to become president. In fact, the popular vote is kind of just a statistic. It doesn't really mean much. Because the Electoral College is how you become president. So Jackson does not win the Electoral College. In fact, nobody does. There's a leader in the Electoral College, or Jackson has more votes, but this system is you have to get above a majority. So the House of Representatives is tasked with picking the president. What they do first is they remove the 4th most votes, and that was William Crawford. And so essentially, the 3 candidates left are Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Henry Clay happens to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so he can essentially, in this election, kind of pick where he wants votes to go. He is not going to put himself in the presidency, but what he does is essentially talks to John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams have a little chat, and John Quincy Adams essentially, we don't necessarily have this written down in paper, which is, something I don't like to repeat things in history that are not necessarily documented. But John Quincy Adams essentially promises Henry Clay the Secretary of State position, which, as I mentioned, is a stepping stone to the White House. So John Quincy Adams is kind of saying to Henry Clay, if you get the House to vote for me and not Jackson, then you'll be president one day, which is kind of a pretty enticing offer for Henry Clay. You can see the little map here. We've got Henry Clay having his western base here. He wins his home state of Kentucky. Jackson wins some southern states, most of the Deep South. He wins North Carolina, where he's from, and Tennessee, where he is now a, quote, native son. And then a lot of support for John Quincy Adams here in the Northeast. That's typically where the Federalists' stronghold was. His dad was a Federalist, so he wins a lot of support there. He's from Massachusetts, and you can see that he wins all 15 electoral votes in Massachusetts. Just looking at these pie charts here, again, we have the electoral vote, no clear winner there. And in the popular vote, Jackson has 43%, which is impressive, but again, ultimately just a statistic. Okay. Jackson is going to go around telling people that this was a corrupt bargain. I think I misspoke earlier when I said Henry Clay was 3rd, but Henry Clay was 4th, so he's eliminated. He throws his support behind John Quincy Adams. So Jackson is making a list of enemies here. First on his list is John Quincy Adams because he feels like he beat John Quincy Adams. Second on his list, not far behind, is Henry Clay because he thinks Henry Clay rigged the House of Representatives vote. so that he could become the Secretary of State. And Jackson is only going to add to his list of enemies. He is going to basically sit on this and stew for 4 years. When he comes back, he's going to, you know, try and go guns a-blazing against John Quincy Adams and against Henry Clay. So yeah, here's our final vote in this, which is John Adams 13, Jackson 7, Crawford 4. And so that shows now that John Quincy Adams is the president of the United States, despite winning in the initial election only 32% of the vote. 32% of the electoral vote, only 31% of the popular vote. So less than a third of America voted for the person who is now president of the United States. You hear a lot of conversations around elections not having the results that are intended. This is definitely one where people are starting to question what's the purpose of the Electoral College? Why can't the people just pick the president? And Andrew Jackson is a huge supporter of that. So much so that when Jackson becomes president, spoiler alert, um, there is a huge call for actually Jackson wants to get rid of the Electoral College. He says it's a corrupt institution, it's elitist, which the founding fathers very much saw that as a benefit. They said the mob is dangerous. We don't want the idiots picking the president and having the president run the country. So they put the Electoral College there for that specific reason, as a filter of democracy, so that the idiots down here, I'm using the word idiots. I don't think any founding father ever used that term, but the founding fathers did not generally trust the average American to select people for president. So, yeah, in any case, you can kind of see on this slide that some of the stuff I've already mentioned, the corrupt bargain is what Jackson calls it. And so for 4 years, Jackson and his supporters go around saying John Quincy Adams is corrupt, the Electoral College is corrupt, Henry Clay is corrupt. All of these guys from the North, especially, are corrupt. They're all cozy with the banks. They're all cozy with people in government, right? Keep in mind the guy who is the president is the son of a former president. So it's very much this kind of elitist, nepotistic kind of thing for the Democratic Party of Jackson. That's a funny little video. If you guys get a chance, you can definitely watch that. John Quincy Adams' presidency is not terribly successful. And again, he's going to be a one-term president, just like his dad. He does not kind of achieve things, and moreover, his legacy is kind of tainted by this corrupt bargain and by Jackson, kind of being a thorn in his side, and kind of every time Quincy Adams would give a speech about what he's trying to achieve, Jackson would come back and say, you're corrupt, you stole this election, all that kind of stuff. Big thing is he's planning to push out something called Henry Clay's American System, devised by Henry Clay. The whole concept of the American system was raising taxes on tariffs, and the money from the tariff would go to these internal improvements. So we would have national universities, we would have observatories, we would fund scientific research, also bridges, roads, canals, those kind of boring infrastructure things. The people in the North are kind of seeing like, hey, if I can get my goods from here to Cincinnati like quicker, then I can make more money. And the quicker way to do that is by train or by, canal, instead of taking my horse and buggy. And so the American system, again, is this policy of trying to collect taxes from tariffs to spend on these internal improvements. The big reason that this is not supported in states in the South, states like where Jackson is from, is because by raising tariffs against countries like England and France, they would also raise tariffs against us. And one of the biggest exports from the United States is cotton and tobacco, these products that the South is producing with slave labor. So if you increase a tariff on goods coming from France and England, they're going to increase their tariffs on goods from America, which means people would buy less cotton, people would buy less tobacco, and that means ultimately that slave owners lose money. So slave owners are not super big fans of this. They're also not big fans of this because a lot of the internal improvements that are proposed are going to benefit the North. So essentially, if you boil this whole American system plan down, is taxes are increased that are going to punish the South, and the things that those taxes are going to pay for aren't even being built in the South. So it's not a great policy for the South. Um, and it's a little misleading to call it the American system when it's really just proposing those changes to northern states, states that would have typically supported Henry Clay or John Quincy Adams. Um, so yeah, John Quincy Adams is kind of misunderstood. Some people talk about how his voice wasn't necessarily commanding and all that kind of stuff. But that gets us to the 1828 election. I want to say that this is John Quincy Adams being photographed, but I want to say that I believe John Quincy Adams is the first president to be photographed. Um, so this is just kind of showing you where technology is at this time. In this rematch of John Quincy Adams versus Jackson, and Henry Clay does not run in this one because he's currently the Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams. Things get really nasty. Like there are insults on both sides. It's more about character than what they plan to do as president. This is what we see in a lot of our elections presently as well. We'll have stuff like in 2016, it was, stuff about corruption and deleting emails and those kinds of things. And it's less about people saying, like, what are they going to do for America when they become elected president? 2020 had a similar kind of vibe, right? It's, this person's corrupt, this person's son is corrupt, and not a lot of people in discussing the 2020 election were talking about differences between the candidates' policies. So, in many ways, this is a modern election. 1828, not too different from 2020 or possibly 2028. Um, and so there's a political cartoon from 2010 where you can see Democrats and Republicans throwing mud at each other and voters saying, we're out. We're not doing this, right? If the Democrats and Republicans just go after each other and they're not appealing to voters, then voters walk away. So Um, yeah, some of the insults here. There are some other attacks that are not mentioned on these slides, such as um, John Quincy Adams's family is going after Jackson. They're saying stuff like Jackson is married to a polygamist, which is kind of a heavy accusation because Jackson's wife, Rachel, she was married to a man and then ran away because this man was abusive, but she never got a divorce. So legally, Jackson's wife is married to him, Jackson, and her former husband, the estranged husband, because she could not get a divorce because it's 1828 and women do not have those kinds of rights. So John Quincy Adams kind of does that attack, which I would say mostly backfired. People could understand that a woman running away from an abusive husband may not have gone through the legal process to get a divorce. Jackson, although kind of brings up this wild story where John Quincy Adams brought over a Russian diplomat or someone in the Russian royal family, the Romanovs, and was setting up one of these Russian guys with some woman who was unmarried. And so Jackson and his supporters basically call John Quincy Adams a pimp, but not in like a friendly way, more in like an insulting way. Like he's using his role as president to like mostly do favors for people and less of like actually governing. So yeah, some wild ones out there. There's probably a whole Wikipedia article on this election that talks about just the personal attacks and going through line by line and saying what each candidate said about each other. So yeah, so Jackson wins this one. Big deal. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in class, but Jackson gets a lot of support from the South. Keep in mind here another difference in this between this election, 1828, and the 1824 election. There's just two candidates in this one. There were four candidates in the other one. William Crawford does not run in this election, so there's not any other candidate in the South that's going to win votes. So that means the whole South is basically supportive of Jackson. And you can kind of see that here. Jackson wins all of the South, this whole yellow blob down here. Worth pointing out, Florida is not a state yet, and Arkansas is not a state yet, but those are soon to be added. John Quincy Adams does win northern states, but as you can see, just 32% of the electoral vote to Jackson's 68%, and the popular vote, which is 56% to Jackson. One thing I want to point out here, I'm going to do my little highlight here, my little focus, is the popular vote here in 1828 is 1.1 million. Okay, we can round that up to 1.2 million if you want. Let me go back a few elections and show you what our 1824 election numbers are. 356,000. Okay. Now, maybe your first conclusion or your first assumption here is that the population of the United States is increasing quite a lot in those 4 years. That is true, but more of what's happening here is that states are rolling back property requirements. So when we go to 1828 and we have our, tons and tons of people voting, the biggest factor for this, let me go back here, is that people that did not own land could now vote for president. So we see the electoral vote, or sorry, we see the popular vote basically triple in 4 years, not necessarily from a population explosion, but from a change of the democracy. And so this whole thing with Jackson is he's been saying since 1824, the people selected me. I'm the man of the people. The people want Jackson. And when we see that more people can vote, Jackson wins even more of a landslide. Okay, he won the popular vote back in 1824, but here 56% is a huge chunk. You're not going to see many elections with that slice of a popular vote. Most of our elections are 51-49, 50.8 to 50.2, those kinds of numbers. So this is a big deal. And then this last slide here is talking about the American system. Okay, I'll try and go through these questions quickly because I've already taken a lot of time on this. First question, why was the Missouri Compromise proposed? Well, simply put, we have Missouri being added as a state. We can't have a slave state being added without having a free state also being added. So we have to make a compromise here. The second question, why did the South readily agree to making slavery illegal in the unorganized Louisiana Purchase? Well, there's parts of this Louisiana territory that they don't think slavery would exist. There's also this kind of future gamble that we can maybe move slave states in there. Yeah, so there's kind of a question mark around places like Texas as well, which is not part of the United States yet. We'll get to that. Yeah. Number 3, how did John Quincy Adams win the election of 1824? If you're an Andrew Jackson supporter, you would say he did it corruptly. If you're a John Quincy Adams supporter, you would say he played politics better than Jackson did. If you can make deals with people in government, you're maybe going to get more done than if you're, a yelling lunatic. But essentially, Henry Clay is a huge part of that. Number 4, what did John Quincy Adams hope to accomplish in his presidency? The biggest probably landmark thing we can point to is what I talked about with the American system. He's hoping to kind of stitch the country together through commerce and through economic growth. It's really hard to do that when you have half of America that is manufacturing with factories and shipping, and the other half of America is producing crops and raw materials using slave labor. Those are two very big differences. Number 5, define favorite son. So this is kind of the concept of the person from this state. So Henry Clay is the favorite son of Kentucky. John Quincy Adams is the favorite son of Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson is the favorite son of Tennessee/North Carolina. Kind of just mentioned corrupt bargain, but this is what Jackson is going to call the 1824 election. And then mudslinging is the term for, kind of going after your opponent, but not in a I'm going to criticize your policies way, more in I'm going to criticize your appearance or your character or something about you that doesn't really matter in the White House. And then why was the Democratic Republican Party formed after the election of 1824? This party is kind of dissolving, to be honest, and the election just becomes, or the party just